So far, President Obama is not getting the support he needs from Congress for a strike on Syria. But the White House is still trying to get more votes on Capitol Hill.
The president didn't pick up any backing from other countries during his international trip this week either. Heather Sells has the story.
President Obama is returning from the G20 summit without the international support that he wanted.
Mr. President, any progress on Syria today in the talks?
We were talking about the economy this afternoon.
Obama says he wants a strike against Syria to deter it from using chemical weapons in the future, but Russian President Vladimir Putin is opposed. Many believe his views are tied in with the fact that Russia has supplied Syria with arms for years. China is also against a strike. Germany will not take part, nor will Britain, and the European Union is calling for a, quote, political solution. French President Francois Hollande is supporting a strike, although France is divided over the possibility. Back at home, opposition on the Hill is growing, and no one seems to know whether Congress will support the president or not.
My biggest concern is if Assad goes and there's division within the rebel movement, some of it connected to al-Qaeda and some of it more moderate, who's going to take over?
There are no good options left in Syria. They're only bad and worse. What I fear the most about Syria is to leave it unattended. It only gets worse over time. 2 years ago, we had some good options. We could have gotten involved with the opposition before al-Qaeda moved in, and we'd have been on the road, I think, to recovery in Syria. Now we've got just bad options and worse options.
7 U.S. senators now say they will oppose a resolution on Syria. It's expected to reach the Senate floor next week. Many questions remain, including this: how large will the strike be? ABC News is reporting that the president's national security team is preparing for a significantly larger bombardment than expected. The president, meanwhile, has canceled travel plans for the week and is expected to address the nation to sell his case. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Well, if the United States launches an attack on Syria, it could mean serious problems for Christians in that country. John Jessup has that story from Washington. John?
That's right, Gordon. Syrian Christians say U.S. military action against the Assad regime will only bring them greater hardship and suffering. Gary Lane has that story.
As Syrians brace themselves for a possible United States military attack, many of the country's Christians are praying for divine intervention. They believe the collective prayers of Christians around the world could reverse an escalating conflict. I talked by phone with a Syrian pastor who resides in the U.S. but travels regularly to Syria. He's in constant contact with Christians inside the country. He asks that we not give his name or show his face in order to protect him and other Syrian Christians from retribution by militant Islamists.
The Christians are living in fear right now in Syria. We know what might happen, and we see the consequence of that, such an action by the U.S. and NATO. That will be a destruction for the Christians in the Middle East, and specifically in Syria.
That's because they say any U.S.-led military attack will only strengthen militant Islamists who have already targeted Christians.
Once NATO hit Syria, that means they're going to weaken the structure and the rule of the system of Syria is going to be destroyed. That means what's going to come next is the Sharia law. And the Sharia law is very much against the existence of Christianity in that part of the world.
Militant Islamists have already forced many Christians out of the country. Others have been murdered or kidnapped, and churches have been destroyed. While many Syrian Christians feel President Obama has abandoned them, they know God has not.
Obama, he cared less for the Christian in Syria and the Christian around the world. We know God has given promises that God's going to protect the Christian community in Syria. And our trust is not in any powers, not in the regime, not in the U.S., and no one else. Our trust in God himself, that he sees and he hears the cries of the Christians.
And that's why it's crucial, this pastor says, that Christians pray for their Syrian brothers and sisters in Christ, because it's more than a battle for the survival of the Syrian church.
This is a battle between Jesus Christ and the enemy himself. And what's happening, the Christians in the Middle East, will happen eventually to many Christians around the world, and specifically to the West.
So Syrian Christians say pray. but they know the outcome is not in the hands of Bashar al-Assad or those who oppose him.
God is not going to go work with anybody's agenda. He's going to work for his own agenda and the purpose of the growing of the kingdom of God.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
The City Council of San Antonio has approved a controversial ordinance that gives protections against bias for gays and transgendered people. The measure forbids city officials from discriminating and applies to most city contracts and contractors. But opponents say it will do more than that. They say it will put a lid on freedom of religious speech. One pastor says it will, quote, criminalize us if we speak our faith. Leading Texas Republicans and religious conservatives nationwide oppose the measure, and opponents say most of the people in the city didn't back it. But it did have the support of the city's Democratic mayor, Julian Castro. Major Nidal Hasan's attack on Fort Hood in 2009 was one of the worst mass shootings on a military base in U.S. history. But victims' families say it should be known as the worst terrorist attack since 9/11. George Thomas has that story.
Army Major Nidal Hasan admits to opening fire at Fort Hood Army Base and killing 13 people.
I went in line to see the doctor, and then that was when the shooting happened.
Hasan says it was all in an effort to stop U.S. soldiers from going to Afghanistan and killing his fellow Muslims. But the attack was tried as a case of workplace violence and not as an act of terror. Now 150 victims and their families are suing the U.S. government. They say the designation of workplace violence robbed them of long-term benefits and made them ineligible to receive the Purple Heart, an award given to those wounded or killed in combat.
I have to think about my children, I have to think about my wife, and I have to think about where I'm going to be in 30 years. Whether I'm going to be able to work, whether I'm going to be able to walk. I have to think about these things.
Senator Susan Collins plans to introduce a bill next week that would ensure the families get the compensation they deserve.
For the administration to persist in treating this as if it were an act of workplace violence is an absolute outrage and disrespectful to the many victims.
Military experts say the government really had no option but to try the case as workplace violence. The crime happened on a military base, so it had to face a court-martial. It would have to have been transferred to civil courts for a terror charge to be possible. Even so, the American Center for Law and Justice is also joining the victims' fight. They've sent a letter to both President Obama and Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, demanding that the U.S. recognize the attack on Fort Hood for what it truly was, calling it, quote, an actual battlefield in the ongoing war against al-Qaeda. George Thomas, CBN News.
A growing number of Americans are worried about protecting their privacy online. According to a new poll from the Pew Research Center, 50% of internet users are concerned that there's too much information about them online. 86% have tried to block others from tracking their online activity, and 68% think that the current laws don't do nearly enough to protect their privacy. Gordon, it seems more and more like privacy is a thing of the past. What do you recommend people do to protect themselves?
Well, it does seem like it's a thing in the past, and based on the latest revelations about the NSA, they can even crack the encryption if you try to encrypt files on your computer and send encrypted files through the internet. They've somehow created weaknesses in the programs that create those encryptions where they can crack it easily and read what you're trying to keep private. I do encourage people, particularly for Google searches, those kinds of things, make sure you've got your Do Not Track button going. You're broadcasting a great deal of information to every website that you visit based on your browsing history, and it's a good idea to try to protect yourself.
Crystal Cathedral founder Robert Schuller has been diagnosed with cancer. The 86-year-old is undergoing treatment for esophageal cancer, which is spread to his lymph nodes. Schuller's daughter Sheila made the announcement during a recent sermon. She says her father said he's ready to go home to be with Jesus, but doctors say with radiation and chemotherapy, he could live 2 more years. Operation Blessing gardening projects are helping communities in Guatemala. One village was buried in 3 inches of black ash when a volcano erupted last year. OB brought in experts to teach villagers how to build raised beds for crops out of materials like bamboo. Families attended weekly training on farming, fertilizers, transplanting, crop management, and much more. OB teams also brought in soil, plastic sheeting, seeds, and organic fertilizer. Families are now able to grow a variety of vegetables and sell extra crops to earn additional income. Operation Blessing has facilitated other farming and gardening projects in El Salvador, Peru, Kenya, and Rwanda. You can find out more about Operation Blessing by going to their website at ob.org.